classic starts. Pinocchio. Retold from the Carlo Collodi original by Tanya Zamorsky. Illustrated by Lucy Curvino. Chapter 1. The Piece of Wood That Laughed and Cried. This is not a story about a great and brave king, little ones. It is not a tale about a princess. No, believe it or not, it is a story about a piece of wood, and not even a fancy piece of wood at that. Just a simple, solid little log. The kind that makes cold rooms cozier when placed into roaring fireplaces in the winter. This particular piece of wood happened to live in a little carpentry shop owned by a Mr. Antonio, whose nose was so round and red and ripe-looking that some people called him Mr. Cherry, after the fruit. Mr. Antonio had big plans for that little piece of wood. He intended to turn it into a leg for his coffee table. But just as he raised his axe and was about to chop, he heard a tiny little voice say, "Oh please, not too hard." Mr. Antonio spun around, but he couldn't see who had spoken. He looked under his workbench, inside the closet, and even sifted through a pile of sawdust, but he found no one. He opened the door and looked up and down the street, still no one. Deciding that he had imagined it, Mr. Antonio raised his axe again. This time he struck the wood. "Ow!" wailed the same wee voice. This was too much for Mr. Antonio. He was so scared now that his eyes bulged like balloons, his stuttering mouth fell open, and his tongue hung out over his lower lip. "Is there someone hiding inside this wood?" he shrieked. "If so, I'll fix you." Mr. Antonio threw the wood on the floor, then smashed it against the walls, and even banged it against the ceiling. "What do you have to say about that?" he asked, feeling slightly silly to be talking to a piece of wood. There was no reply. Mr. Antonio sat perfectly still and waited for an additional 10 minutes, but there was still nothing. "I did imagine it," he concluded with relief. Taking some sandpaper, Mr. Antonio began to smooth and shape the cut wood. And wouldn't you know it, the little voice came back. This time it was giggling. "Oh, hee, ha ha," it said. "Stop it! That sandpaper tickles my sensitive skin." This was the last straw. Poor Mr. Antonio was so confused and upset that he fell to the floor, his bright red nose turning blue. At that moment, Mr. Cherry looked more like Mr. Blueberry. Just then, there was a knock at the door. It was Mr. Antonio's friend, Geppetto. Geppetto was a jolly old man with a nickname of his own. The boys in the neighborhood teased him and called him Polendina, the Italian word for polenta, because his yellow wig looked like a bowl of that cornmeal mush. Geppetto hated this nickname and flew into a rage whenever anyone used it. Of course, this only made people do it more often. "My friend," Geppetto asked Mr. Antonio as he entered, "what are you doing on the floor?" "What do you think I am doing? Teaching the ants the alphabet?" Mr. Antonio joked. "I fell down." "What brings you here?" "My legs," Geppetto joked back. "They've something very exciting to tell you. I've decided to make a puppet. One that can dance and do flips in the air. Together, we will travel the world and become rich and famous. What do you think?" "Sounds like a great plan, Polendina," yelled you-know-who. Geppetto's face turned bright red. "What did you call me?" he asked his friend. "I didn't say a word," Mr. Antonio replied truthfully. "You called me Polendina," Geppetto growled. Mr. Antonio said, "No, I didn't." "Yes, you did," Geppetto yelled. This happened a few times, the men growing angrier every time. Eventually the words turned to blows and bites, slaps and kicks, shrieks and scratches. When the fight was over, the men realized that each was holding the other's wig. "Let's give each other back our hair," Mr. Antonio suggested. "Good idea, my friend," Geppetto replied, and soon each man's hair was his own again. Listen, Mr. Antonio said, I have just the thing for the puppet you are planning to make. Mr. Antonio went to his bench to get the piece of wood. Just as he was about to hand it over, however, it slipped out of his hands and violently smacked Geppetto in the shins. What kind of friend hits another with a piece of wood? Geppetto asked. I didn't do it, Mr. Antonio said. Yes, you did, Geppetto shouted. It was the wood's fault, not mine, Mr. Antonio insisted. And even though I didn't do so before, if you don't believe me, I will call you Polendina. Geppetto promptly called Mr. Antonio an idiot, a donkey, and an extremely ugly monkey. Mr. Antonio stuck to Polendina, and another fight started. When it was over, both wigs were still on their rightful heads, but the bodies below them had many bruises and the shirts had quite a few missing buttons. We're getting too old for this, Geppetto said, dusting himself off. Yes, we are. The two friends were finally in agreement. And with that, Geppetto took his new piece of wood and happily limped home. Chapter 2, The Prankster Puppet is Born. Geppetto lived in a small, simple house. The only thing rich about him was his imagination. Instead of a real fireplace, he had painted one on the wall. Over the fake fire, instead of a real pot full of real food, was a painted pot. It was bubbling over so beautifully that you could almost smell the delicious stew painted inside. Geppetto couldn't wait to get started carving and painting his puppet. He even had the perfect name picked out, Pinocchio. Upon placing the finishing touches on Pinocchio's eyes, Geppetto was surprised to see the eyes blinking and staring back at him. What are you staring at? Geppetto asked, but there was no response. Next, Geppetto painted the puppet's perfect little nub of a nose. To his surprise, the still wet nose immediately began to grow. Geppetto kept trimming it, but he couldn't keep up. Soon the little nub looked more like a long narrow needle. Ducking away from the still-growing nose, Geppetto gave up and started painting the puppet's mouth. As soon as the mouth was finished, however, it began to laugh and make fun of its maker. Stop it! Geppetto said angrily. And how did the mouth respond? It stuck out one very long tongue. Geppetto decided he would ignore this bad behavior. After all, he had a great deal more work to do. As he was finishing the puppet's delicate fingertips, Geppetto felt a cool breeze on his bald head. Why, the puppet had used his brand new hands to pull off his maker's wig. Pinocchio put the hair on his own head, which was so much smaller than Geppetto's head that half of the puppet was promptly hidden. Geppetto was getting slightly nervous. He wasn't even done making his wooden doll, and already the creature was misbehaving. Geppetto probably should have considered such risks before he'd started, but it was too late now. Retrieving his stolen wig and placing it back on his own head, Geppetto bent down to paint and polish Pinocchio's legs and feet. And wouldn't you know it? As soon as those feet were finished, one of them flew up and kicked Geppetto right in the nose. I must be patient, Geppetto told himself. Just as one is with a little baby. Taking the puppet under his arm, Geppetto put him on the floor and showed him how to walk. He learned just like a human child, bit by bit, one foot after the other. Unlike a human child, however, Pinocchio got the hang of that walking business in no time at all and quickly graduated to running around the room. In fact, he ran right out the open door and down the street. Geppetto tried to catch him, but it was no use. That puppet ran like the wind. Instead of stopping him, as Geppetto begged, the townspeople just stepped aside and stared and laughed. Pinocchio ran and ran. In fact, he ran right into the legs of a policeman, who did not take too kindly to runaway puppets. Grabbing Pinocchio by the nose, which made a perfect handle, he held him still until Geppetto reached the scene. Geppetto thanked the officer. To Pinocchio, he said, "Young man, you and I are going to settle this when we get home." Pinocchio threw himself on the ground and refused to move. Help, he cried. Don't let this mean man take me. A concerned crowd gathered around. Shame on you, Geppetto, they cried. Of course he doesn't want to go home if you are only going to hit him. Who said anything about hitting? Geppetto asked. But Pinocchio was quite an actor. Yes, he cried. My father beats me terribly. The policeman, who took even less kindly to poor parents than to runaway puppets, now came and grabbed Geppetto. Ungrateful boy! Geppetto cried as he was dragged away to jail. To think that I tried so hard to make the perfect puppet. With his father in prison, Pinocchio was free to do as he liked. Running through fields like a wild and happy billy goat, he raced home, locked the door behind him, and threw himself on the couch. This is the life, he sighed. Just then, he heard someone saying, "Cri, cri, cri." Looking around, he saw a big cricket crawling up the wall. Is that you making that sound? Pinocchio demanded. It is, Cricket replied. And I will have you know that I have been living in this room and making that sound for well over 100 years. Well, it's my room now, Pinocchio said. So I suggest you stop talking and get out. Shame on you, Cricket said. The way you disobeyed your father and ran away from home. Keep cricking, silly bug. Pinocchio replied. Tomorrow I will run away again. Do you really think I'm going to stay here and get sent to school and forced to study? I am going to play and chase butterflies and climb trees all day. You are the silly one. Cricket insisted. If you don't go to school, you'll turn into a stupid donkey and everyone will laugh at you. At the very least, you should learn a trade. A skill of some sort, so that you can earn an honest living. Good idea, Pinocchio replied, and it seemed as if he was serious. You know what trade I'll learn? What? Cricket asked. The trade of being a bum. Pinocchio screamed, laughing. I will be a professional eater, drinker, and sleeper. So there. The smart old Cricket sighed. Oh, Pinocchio, he said sadly, those trades will only send you to the hospital or to prison. You are making me angry, Pinocchio warned him. But Cricket was getting angry, too. I feel sorry for you, he continued, with your wooden head. In a fit of temper, Pinocchio leaped up, grabbed Geppetto's hammer, and threw it at Cricket. But, thankfully, Pinocchio's aim was not as fine-tuned as his temper. You missed me by a mile, Cricket huffed, unharmed, and promptly left the house. As night fell, a queer feeling settled over Pinocchio's stomach. What is that? Pinocchio wondered. Then he remembered that he hadn't had anything to eat the entire time he had been alive. I am absolutely starving. He realized. Oh, if only my father was here to make me dinner. He ran to the fireplace, where the pot was bubbling over. But when he reached out to touch it, he discovered that it was only a delicious-looking painting. Pinocchio ran all around the house, looking for even the smallest scrap of bread. But there was nothing. He was positively dizzy with hunger. Cricket was right, he thought, and he started to cry. It was wrong of me to disobey my father and run away from home. Suddenly, in the corner of the room, Pinocchio saw something round and white. An egg, he cried. I'm saved! And now, how should I cook you? Pinocchio asked the egg. Should I fry you or boil you or poach you? Deciding that poaching would be the fastest method, Pinocchio placed a pan filled with water on the stove, turned on the heat, and cracked the egg on the side of the pan. But instead of the uncooked yolk that Pinocchio expected, out came a fluffy yellow chick, grinning broadly. Why, thank you, puppet, the chick said, stretching and bowing. I thought I would have to break that shell myself. Wishing Pinocchio good luck and bidding him goodbye, the little chick spread his wings and flew straight out the window. Staring after his escaped dinner, Pinocchio began to whine and stomp his wooden feet. But the noise he made was not loud enough to drown out his growling stomach. Oh, he thought, if only Cricket was still here. Maybe he could have made me some dinner. Pinocchio decided that he would go for a walk to the village. If he begged, perhaps someone would give him a bit of bread. It was cold and stormy, not the best of nights to be outside begging for bread. Pinocchio was afraid of the dark and of storms, and it was getting late, but he was so hungry that he set out in search of food anyway. He ran as fast as his wooden legs would carry him. When he got to the village, the streets were dark and deserted. All the stores were closed. Desperate, Pinocchio ran up to a door and rang the bell wildly. Someone had to answer. An old man in his pajamas opened a second-story window and looked out. "Who's there?" he shouted down angrily. "What do you want at this time of night? I know it's late, but could you please give me a bit of bread?" Pinocchio called up. "I am so terribly hungry." "Wait right there," the old man said, and Pinocchio thought he was saved. "I'll throw something down." Pinocchio stood under the window, preparing to catch his delicious dinner. Instead, he felt a shower of ice-cold water pour down on his poor wooden head. Looking up, he saw the old man holding a now empty pot upside down. "That will teach you to ring people's doorbells when they are peacefully asleep," the man yelled. Upset, the soaking wet puppet walked back home. Once inside, he sat down on Geppetto's little work stool and put his 2 feet up on the stove to dry them. The fire felt so nice and warm on his cold toes. But they were, after all, cold wooden toes, and when he fell asleep, a spark from the fire landed on them and they began to burn. While Pinocchio snored happily away, not feeling a thing, his feet blackened and then turned to ash. At dawn, a loud knocking at the door woke Pinocchio. "Who is it?" he called, yawning and rubbing his sleepy eyes. "Idasai," a voice replied. It was Geppetto's voice. Pinocchio was so excited that he jumped up to run to the door. He didn't know yet that his feet were gone. But because they were, he tripped and hit the floor with an enormous bang. "Open the door for me!" Geppetto shouted. "Oh, father, I can't," Pinocchio cried, rolling about, footless, on the floor. "Why can't you?" Pinocchio spotted a cat playing in a pile of wood chips in the corner. "The cat has eaten my feet," he replied. "Open this door," Geppetto warned, "or you will go to bed tonight without supper." "Oh, father, please believe me. I cannot stand up." Finally, Geppetto entered through a window. Seeing that Pinocchio was telling the truth, he felt horrible. Picking up his puppet, Geppetto cried as he rubbed Pinocchio's wooden head. "How did this happen?" he asked. Pinocchio wasn't sure. In between sobs, he told his father all about his night. When he mentioned putting his feet up on the stove to dry them, Geppetto said, "Ah. Now my feet are gone, but my hunger still isn't." Pinocchio finished. Geppetto pulled 3 pears out of his pocket. He had been saving them for his own breakfast, but his son was hungry. Pinocchio instantly perked up. Almost immediately, though, he had a demand. "I do not eat pears that haven't been peeled," he told his father. Geppetto was surprised. "Are you really such a fusspot?" he asked. "In this world, my boy, we must learn to eat everything, because we never know when we might find ourselves hungry again." "But I don't like the skins," Pinocchio insisted. "Please won't you peel them for me?" So Geppetto took out his knife and peeled the pears, leaving the skins on the table. When he finished with the first pear, Pinocchio started to throw the core away, but Geppetto stopped him. "Don't throw that core away. We may have some use for it." Pinocchio grew enraged. "First the peels, and now this." Do you really imagine that I, Pinocchio, would ever eat a pear core? He sniffed. Never say never, Geppetto said, and placed the pear cores next to the skins on the table. Well, wouldn't you know it? A few minutes later, Pinocchio was still hungry. Is there anything else to eat? He whined. Only the skins and cores, Geppetto replied calmly. Oh, all right. Pinocchio cried. He picked up a piece of peel, and then a core, and started to nibble them. He complained to himself and made faces with every bite, but before he knew it, he had devoured every last bit of both, and felt undoubtedly better. I don't want to say I told you so, Geppetto said, but after all, I did. Chapter 3, On New Feet, Pinocchio sets off to school. With his belly full, Pinocchio could now concentrate entirely on, and cry about, his poor burned feet. To punish him for his bad behavior, Geppetto let Pinocchio cry for a while. Finally he said, I could make you new feet, but why should I? So you can just run away again? I won't run away, Pinocchio said, sniffling. I'll be good from now on. I'll go to school and do my homework. I will learn a trade and take care of you in your old age. I promise. Geppetto tried to look stern, but his eyes filled with tears. He couldn't stand to see Pinocchio souffre. So, taking his tools and 2 pieces of wood, he got to work. A few minutes later, 2 beautiful new wooden feet sat on the table. They were even stronger and faster than the first pair. Taking a bit of glue, Geppetto attached the new feet to Pinocchio's burned stumps. He did this so skillfully, you could barely tell that the legs were not made from 2 solid pieces of wood. Whole again, Pinocchio immediately leaped off the table and started to skip and jump around. To show you how grateful I am, he cried, I am going to use my new feet to run straight to school. But first, I need some new clothes. Poor Geppetto had no money for new clothes, so he made his son a stylish suit out of pretty paper. Taking some tree bark, he made a sharp pair of shoes. Finally, with a bit of bread dough, he made Pinocchio a dashing little cap. Why, I look like a proper gentleman. Pinocchio cried, as he admired himself in the mirror. But there is one important thing I still need. What is it? Geppetto asked. A workbook to learn my ABCs. Geppetto realized Pinocchio was right. I have no money, he said sadly. And a workbook is not as easy to make as a cap. Pinocchio's face fell. Seeing Pinocchio look so disappointed was very hard for Geppetto. He quickly pulled on his old coat and left the house. A few minutes later, Geppetto was back. In his hands was a workbook. But he was no longer wearing the old coat. Instead, he stood in his short-sleeved shirt. I was hot, Geppetto explained, shivering violently. Oh, father, Pinocchio said, realizing that Geppetto had sold his coat for the book. Running over to his father, Pinocchio kissed him again and again. The next morning, Pinocchio couldn't wait to go to school. He was so excited about all of the things he was going to learn. Soon, I will be smart enough to earn a lot of money and buy my father a new coat. And it won't be just any old coat. It will be a gold and silver coat, with diamond buttons. Even as he thought this, though, he heard the sound of pipes and drums coming from a distance. Pi pi pi, the pipes and drums called. Bum, dum, bum. Pinocchio hesitated. He had promised to go to school, but the sounds were so tempting. How could he resist finding out where they were coming from? He decided he couldn't stay away from the music. I'll go to school tomorrow, he told himself. What's one more day? On his brand new feet, Pinocchio ran toward the sounds until he reached a large plaza. There he saw a tiny wooden building painted in brilliant colors. What's in there? Pinocchio asked a little boy standing next to him. Can't you read? the boy asked, pointing to a sign on the door. Having skipped school, however, Pinocchio couldn't. Not today, he replied. It says Great Puppet Theater, dummy, the boy said. And the show is about to start. Other puppets, just like him, putting on a show? Pinocchio was crazy with curiosity. How much is a ticket? He asked. 4 pennies. But Pinocchio didn't have even 1 penny. Will you lend me the money? Not today, the boy replied. T'll sell you my coat. And what would I do with your paper coat? The boy scoffed. When it rains, it will turn to glue. T'll sell you my shoes, Pinocchio said, trying again. For what? The boy replied. To light a fire with? What about my hat? Pinocchio asked. That might be all right if my pet mouse needs a snack. Pinocchio took a deep breath. There was only one other thing he had to offer. But could he? After his freezing cold father had made such a warm and loving sacrifice? Pinocchio decided he could. I will sell you my brand new workbook, he said. The boy refused. But an old man sitting nearby heard the offer and accepted. He knew that he could sell the book to buy a nice new coat for himself. Pinocchio quickly made the exchange. With the pennies in his hand and his father's sacrifice already forgotten, he ran toward the theater's entrance to buy a ticket. When Pinocchio entered the theater, the show had already started. 2 puppets named Harlequin and Punchinello were on stage, acting out a fight. They punched each other and called each other names, while the audience pointed and laughed. Suddenly Harlequin stopped talking and pointed into the audience. He had spotted Pinocchio. Punchinello saw him as well. There's a puppet in the audience, she screamed, sitting like a proper person. When the other puppets heard this, they all came streaming on stage to see. Come join us! Harlequin shouted. With a giant leap and one helpful bounce off the orchestra leader's head, Pinocchio landed on the stage. Oh, how the puppets embraced their puppet brother. The audience, however, was angry that the play had been interrupted. They began to yell and grumble, demanding their money back. Hearing the commotion, the theater director came out of his office. He was terribly scary-looking, with a long black beard and a pair of mean eyes that glowed like 2 red coals. In his huge, hairy hands, he held a long whip made of green snakes and black cats' tails twisted together. He swung the whip through the air in a threatening way. The puppets froze, trembling like leaves in a violent storm. The show must go on, the director yelled, and the puppets immediately went back into character. Pinocchio started to walk away, too, but the director grabbed him by the collar. Not so fast, he said. You caused me quite a bit of trouble today, and you are going to have to pay for it. The director hung Pinocchio up on a nail by the back of his coat. The puppet wiggled like a worm. After the curtain went down, the director walked back into the theater's kitchen, where a leg of lamb, his dinner, was slowly roasting. On the spit. Although it was still only morning, the leg was so big that it needed to cook all day. But the fire underneath the lamb was dying. The director needed more wood to finish cooking his food. He liked his lamb well done. The director told Harlequin and Punchinello to take Pinocchio down off the nail and bring him to the kitchen. The 2 theater puppets obeyed. Oh, someone help me, Pinocchio cried as they presented him to the director. I don't want to die. My poor father will be heartbroken. The director hesitated. Thinking about the fact that the piece of wood intended for the fire bade a father, the director found it hard to throw it in the pit. He imagined how sad Geppetto would be, and let Pinocchio go. All of the puppets breathed a sigh of relief. But there was still the matter of the director's half-cooked lamb. You, he cried, pointing to Harlequin instead. You'll do. The director moved to throw the other puppet on the fire. "Wait!" Pinocchio cried, surprising everyone, most especially himself. Throwing himself at the director's feet, he begged him to take pity on Harlequin. "Take me instead," he cried. Everyone waited, holding their breath. "Oh, fine," the director finally said, shrugging. "I suppose tonight I shall have to eat my lamb rare." What a relief! Chapter 4, Pinocchio Meets Fox and Cat. The next morning, the director sent Pinocchio off with well wishes and 5 pieces of gold. He had given Pinocchio the gold after the puppet had described how poor Geppetto had sold his only coat. "Goodbye, fellow puppets," Pinocchio cried, and set off for home. A few steps down the road, he met a lame fox and a blind cat walking arm in arm. "Good morning, Pinocchio," Fox said. "How do you know my name?" the puppet asked. "We know your father as well. We saw him just yesterday, shivering in his shirt sleeves." "Oh, poor father!" Pinocchio cried. "Well, after today, he will shiver no longer. I have become a rich man." Thinking Pinocchio a poor, silly puppet, Cat and Fox just laughed. "Stop laughing at me," Pinocchio said angrily. "I can prove it." And with that, he took the gold pieces out of his pocket and revealed them. At the sight of the gold, 2 interesting things happened. First, the supposedly lame fox reached out his paw. Then the supposedly blind cat opened his eyes wide with excitement and greed. The paw and the eyes returned so quickly to their original conditions, however, that Pinocchio did not notice. "So, what do you plan to do with your money?" Fox asked casually. "I am going to buy a new coat for my father, and a new workbook for myself," Pinocchio said. "Then I can study." "Are you sure you want to do that?" Fox asked grimly. "Studying made me lame." "Studying made me blind," Cat added. A blackbird perched on a fence nearby started to say something that sounded like a warning, but in the blink of a not-so-blind eye, the cat leaped up and ate him, feathers and feet and all. "Why did you do that?" Pinocchio asked, alarmed. "That bird talked too much," Cat said. Not unlike a certain cricket, Pinocchio thought. "And how did you do that, if you are blind?" Pinocchio asked. "Oh, just lucky," Cat replied. "You can be lucky, too," Fox told the puppet. "You can turn your 5 gold pieces into 2,000. "How?" Pinocchio breathed. "Come with us to the city of simpletons," Fox replied. Pinocchio's face fell. "I can't," he said. "Father has been waiting for me." Cricket was right. Children who do not listen cannot be happy in this world. "Nonsense," Fox said. Pinocchio hesitated. He had to ask. How can 5 gold pieces possibly become 2,000? And so Cat and Fox explained that just outside the city of simpletons, there was a magical field called the Field of Wonders. If you went there at dawn, dug a hole and buried a gold piece, and then watered it well and sprinkled it with a pinch of salt, the gold piece would grow into a beautiful tree whose leaves and flowers were glittering gold pieces. Pinocchio was filled with hope. Forgetting his father, the new coat, the workbook, and all his good resolutions, he told his new friends. "Let's go!" Cat and Fox and Puppet walked a long time, but the Field of Wonders was far away and night was setting in. When they came to an inn called the Inn of the Red Shrimp, Fox suggested they stop to eat and rest. "At midnight we'll start out again, for at dawn tomorrow we must be at the field." Cat felt very weak and was able to eat only 35 sardines with tomato sauce and 4 helpings of spaghetti with butter and cheese. Fox was fat, and his doctor had put him on a diet, so he had to be satisfied with a sweet and sour rabbit and a dozen young and tender spring chickens. And a few partridges. And some pheasants. and a dozen frogs and lizards. But that was all. When supper was over, Fox asked the innkeeper for 2 rooms so that the group could take a nap. And give us a wake-up call at midnight, Fox said. Yes, sir, the innkeeper said. Once in his room, Pinocchio immediately fell into a deep sleep, full of fantastic dreams of magical, gold-filled fields. Just as Pinocchio was about to reach out to grab the gold in his dream, he was awaked by 3 loud knocks at the door. It was the innkeeper. Cat and Fox left 2 hours ago, he said. Cat was called home on an emergency. They said you agreed to pay for supper, he added. They did? Pinocchio asked. Perhaps he had agreed, although he couldn't remember doing so. Where did they say they would meet me? At the Field of Wonders, at sunrise. You had better start walking now. Pinocchio paid 1 gold piece for the 3 suppers and the 2 rooms and headed out. It was very hard going. It was dark, and he didn't have any directions. A few bats skimmed his nose now and again and scared him half to death. Once or twice he shouted, "Who goes there?" and the faraway hills echoed back to him, "Who goes there? Who goes there? Who goes?" Suddenly Pinocchio noticed a tiny insect sitting on the trunk of a nearby tree, glowing strangely in the moonlight. "Who are you?" Pinocchio asked. Then he realized it was the talking cricket. Pinocchio shivered. Cricket looked almost ghostly, or at least like a firefly glowing in the dark. "I want to give you a few words of advice. Return home and give the 4 gold pieces you have left to your father, who misses you terribly." "But Cricket," Pinocchio insisted, "tomorrow I will make father a rich man, for these 4 remaining pieces will become thousands. There is no such thing as overnight wealth, my boy. Go home." "But I want to go on," Pinocchio insisted. "What did I once tell you about disobedient boys?" Cricket asked. "The same nonsense you are telling me now," Pinocchio replied. "You still talk too much. Goodbye." "Goodbye, Pinocchio," Cricket said. "And good luck escaping the danger that awaits you." "What danger?" Pinocchio wondered out loud. But Cricket's light was gone, as if someone had blown out a candle. The road was once again pitch black and lonely. Chapter 5: The Danger. How hard it is to be a boy, Pinocchio thought as he walked. Everyone scolds us and gives us advice and warns us of danger, as if they were our mother or father or teacher. I think danger is something invented by grown-ups, to frighten children who want to have fun. Why, even if I encounter some danger, Pinocchio vowed, I will stare it in the face and say, "What do you want?" "Ha! I'm not afraid of you." Suddenly, however, Pinocchio was very afraid, for he thought he heard a slight rustle in the leaves behind him. When he turned to look, he saw 2 dark figures wrapped from head to foot in black sacks. Danger! Pinocchio thought. In the form of muggers or assassins. Not knowing where to put the gold pieces, he put them under his tongue. He tried to run, but the masked figures grabbed his arm and yelled, "Your money or your life." Pinocchio could not speak with the gold pieces in his mouth, so he tried to indicate with hand gestures that he was only a poor puppet without so much as a penny in his pocket. "Don't waste our time, puppet," said the taller figure. "Or we'll hurt both you and your father." "Not father!" Pinocchio cried. As he screamed, the gold pieces rattled in his mouth. "Aha!" the muggers cried. "Spit that money out immediately." Pinocchio refused, keeping his lips tightly sealed even after the muggers held his nose and shook him from side to side. When one of the muggers tried to pry Pinocchio's wooden lips open with a knife, the puppet used his sharp splintery teeth to bite the mugger's hand. Imagine his surprise when he felt fur on his tongue and realized that he had bitten into a paw. Pinocchio broke away and ran. The muggers were close behind. After running about 7 miles, Pinocchio was exhausted and climbed up a tree. The muggers tried to climb up after him, but they slipped and fell. Ha ha! Pinocchio called down. Joke's on you, one of the muggers replied, and Pinocchio watched, wide-eyed, as they gathered up some wood, piled it at the base of the tree, and set it on fire. When the flames rose high enough to tickle his feet, Pinocchio jumped out of the tree and the chase was on again. Just when he thought he could run no farther, Pinocchio spotted a little cottage up ahead among the trees. If I can only make it there, he thought, I will be safe. Reaching the door, he knocked wildly. He could hear the footsteps and breaths of the muggers close behind him. There was no answer at the cottage. In despair, Pinocchio began to kick the door. An upstairs window opened, and a pretty but very pale girl looked out. Her hair was blue. In a weak voice she whispered, "No one lives here." "You live here," Pinocchio cried. "Please, open the door. I am being chased by muggers." Just then, however, the muggers caught up to him and grabbed him and dragged him away. "We've got you now," they growled. Pinocchio shook so hard from fear that the coins rattled under his tongue. "This time you will open your mouth," the muggers vowed. A few minutes later, Pinocchio found himself hanging like a Christmas ornament in an oak tree, with a noose around his neck. The muggers waited for Pinocchio to give his last gasp, but when he didn't, they got bored and tired. "Goodbye until tomorrow,"